In October 2024, a routine review of a Victorian-era photograph led to one of the most unexpected discoveries in the study of women's history in 19th-century America. What started as an ordinary cataloging job at a Boston auction house slowly turned into an investigation that lasted 4 months, crossed 3 states, and finally uncovered a forgotten network of courage that had remained hidden in plain sight for more than 137 years. The photograph itself had survived for over a century, stored away in the attic of an old textile mill owner's mansion in Lowell, Massachusetts. When the estate was finally sold after years of legal disputes, its belongings were scattered among different auction houses and antique dealers across New England. Among hundreds of objects was one framed family portrait dated 1887. At first look, it seemed completely ordinary. 7 people sat and stood in formal Victorian clothing, their faces serious and still, just as people posed in that era. Dr. Emily Richardson, a curator at the Massachusetts Historical Society who specialized in 19th-century social records, had examined thousands of similar photographs during her 15-year career. Studio portraits from the 1880s followed strict rules, fixed poses, careful placement of family members by status, and a strong sense of formality. On that rainy afternoon, as she prepared items for an upcoming exhibition, Richardson almost recorded the photograph and moved on. But something made her stop. It may have been the odd position of one woman's hand, or the way the light fell on a small detail. Richardson took out her magnifying glass and leaned closer. What she noticed made her heart beat faster. The woman seated on the left, who appeared to be in her mid-30s with dark hair and a high-collared dress, held her left hand in a way that felt strange, almost unnatural for a formal portrait. Her hand rested on her lap, but 3 fingers were extended in a very specific way, while her thumb and index finger touched at their tips, forming what looked like a clear symbol. Richardson caught her breath. In all her years studying Victorian photographs, she had never seen such a gesture in a formal family portrait. These photographs were carefully planned, costly events where every detail was chosen with care. Random hand positions simply did not occur. If this gesture appeared in the image, it had to be intentional. It was a deliberate message, frozen in time, waiting to be noticed. Richardson spent the rest of the afternoon recording every detail of the photograph. The back of the frame offered the first clues. A small paper label, yellowed and partly torn, showed the printed words Whitmore Studio, Lowell, Mass. 1887, in elegant Victorian lettering. Beneath it, written by hand in faded ink, were the words, "The Harrison Family." With this information, Richardson began looking into who these people were and what the strange hand gesture might mean. The next morning, she traveled to the Lowell Historical Society, a small brick building filled with city records, business listings, and detailed documents related to the textile industry that had shaped the region throughout the 19th century. Within a few hours, Richardson identified the family. Thomas Harrison appeared in the 1887 Lowell City Directory as the owner of a modestly successful dry goods store on Merrimack Street. Census records from 1880 listed him, his wife Catherine, and their 3 children. The household also included Catherine's unmarried sister, recorded as Eleanor Parker, age 34. Richardson's pulse quickened as she compared the photograph with the census records. The woman with the unusual hand gesture matched the age and description of Eleanor Parker, but the census showed something else that stood out. Eleanor was not listed as keeping house, as most unmarried women of her time were, but as a seamstress. This detail mattered in the 1880s. Lowell seamstresses often worked in the huge textile mills that employed thousands of workers, many of them young women from rural families or recent immigrants seeking independence. Richardson requested access to employment records from the Boot Cotton Mills and the Lawrence Manufacturing Company, 2 of Lowell's largest textile operations at the time. What she found described a harsh industrial world. Workdays lasted 12 to 14 hours. Conditions were dangerous, wages barely covered survival, and workers, especially women, had almost no legal protection. Accidents happened often. Illness spread easily, and anyone who complained risked being fired immediately. Yet Eleanor Parker's name did not appear in the mill records. Instead, Richardson uncovered something far more interesting. Eleanor was listed in the records of St. Anne's Episcopal Church as a visiting nurse who cared for workers' families. This position would have given her access to many homes, deep knowledge of families in trouble, and a level of trust and freedom that was rare for women at the time. The pieces were starting to connect, but Richardson still did not understand the meaning of the hand gesture. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. While studying Victorian women's groups and charitable organizations, Richardson found a brief reference in a scholarly article about women's reform movements in industrial cities. The article, published in 1998, mentioned that some women's aid societies in the 1880s had developed secret signals to identify safe houses and trusted people without drawing attention from hostile authorities or abusive family members. The article referred to a collection of personal letters kept at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard University. Richardson contacted the library immediately and arranged a visit. 3 days later, she sat in the climate-controlled reading room, carefully turning the fragile pages of letters exchanged between women involved in what they called protective work, efforts to help women and children escape dangerous homes and exploitative labor. One letter dated March 1886, written by a woman named Harriet from Lawrence, Massachusetts, contained a rough drawing in the margin. The sketch showed a hand with 3 fingers extended and the thumb and index finger touching, exactly like the gesture in Eleanor Parker's photograph. Below the drawing, Harriet had written, "Remember our sign, 3 for the trinity of safety, shelter, sustenance, and secrecy. The circle means our network is unbroken. Show this to any woman in need, and she will know you are a friend." Richardson leaned back in her chair, her thoughts racing. This was not a random pose or a photographic accident. Eleanor Parker had intentionally placed a coded message in her family portrait, marking herself as part of a hidden network devoted to helping vulnerable women and children. The fact that she managed to include this symbol in a formal studio portrait paid for by her brother-in-law was both bold and clever, but it also raised a serious question. Why take such a risk? Family portraits were expensive and proudly displayed in homes seen by relatives and visitors alike. If the wrong person recognized the sign, Eleanor could face serious consequences. Victorian society was harsh toward women who challenged family authority or helped wives leave their husbands no matter the reason. Richardson wanted to understand Eleanor Parker more deeply, who she was, how she became involved in this work, and what dangers she faced. She returned to Lowell and began searching for personal records that could reveal more about Eleanor's life. Church registers, property records, newspaper archives, and court documents slowly filled in her story. Eleanor Parker was born in 1853 in rural New Hampshire, the youngest of 5 children in a farming family. At 19, she married a man named David, but records from the Hillsborough County Courthouse showed the marriage ended after only 18 months. The entry was brief but clear: petition for separation granted due to cruel treatment. In the 1870s, separation was rare and scandalous, suggesting the abuse had been severe and well proven. This experience likely shaped Eleanor's dedication to helping other women. After the separation, she moved to Lowell to live with her sister Catherine and brother-in-law Thomas. There, she trained as a nurse through a program run by St. Anne's Episcopal Church, part of a growing effort to provide basic medical care to industrial workers and their families. By 1880, Eleanor was regularly visiting tenements and boarding houses throughout Lowell's Mill District. Richardson found mentions of her in church meeting notes and local newspapers from the 1880s. She was described as devoted to charity and praised for her Christian service to suffering families. But by reading carefully and comparing documents, Richardson realized these public roles likely hid more risky work. Eleanor's job as a visiting nurse gave her a perfect cover. These nurses moved through working-class neighborhoods, immigrant housing, and mill boarding houses, offering care to families who could not afford doctors. This allowed Eleanor access to the most vulnerable people, families facing illness, injury, poverty, and the daily strain of factory life. She saw the damage caused by 12-hour shifts in dangerous mills, children forced to work instead of going to school, and women trapped in violent marriages considered private matters beyond the law. Richardson noticed that Eleanor's visits often lasted longer than medical care required, and that she returned to the same homes again and again. This suggested she was doing more than nursing. She was building trust, forming relationships, and quietly offering help to women with no other support. With Eleanor Parker's name and the meaning of the hand signal, Richardson widened her search beyond Lowell. She contacted archives, museums, and libraries across Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, asking them to look for photographs from the 1880s and 1890s that showed the same gesture or something similar. Responses arrived within weeks, and they were striking. A small museum in Providence held a cabinet card from 1889 showing 3 women at a church gathering, one subtly displaying the same 3-finger sign. The New Hampshire Historical Society found a family portrait from 1891 where an elderly woman's hand formed a similar shape. The American Textile History Museum in Lowell had an 1888 photograph of mill workers, and in the back row, Richardson spotted 2 women with their hands arranged in the familiar pattern. Each discovery raised more questions and led to deeper research. Richardson began creating a database recording the names, locations, jobs, and family ties of these women. A pattern slowly appeared, both powerful and heartbreaking. Nearly all were connected to industrial labor as seamstresses, mill workers, domestic servants, or laborers. Many were unmarried, widowed, or, like Eleanor, separated from abusive husbands. They lived in New England, towns shaped by textile factories that relied heavily on women and child labor. Richardson even found brief mentions of these women in church records, where they were praised for providing Christian charity to suffering families, quiet hints of a much braver story hidden beneath the surface. Local newspaper reports from the 1880s and 1890s occasionally mentioned these women as members of temperance groups or moral reform societies, roles that were socially acceptable and provided a respectable face for women's activism. Yet the evidence showed that these public efforts often acted as a shield for far more risky and controversial work. What made Eleanor Parker's network truly unique was its level of planning and secrecy. Unlike well-known reform groups, this network worked almost entirely out of sight, relying on coded signs, trusted messengers, and careful silence to avoid drawing attention from people who would oppose them. The hand gesture and the photographs served several purposes at once. They allowed members of the network to recognize one another. They recorded their commitment for future generations, and they created a lasting record that could not easily be destroyed or denied, unlike letters or spoken accounts. Richardson found proof that the network operated several safe houses in Lowell alone. These were simple homes and small apartments where women and children could stay for short periods, while longer-term plans were arranged. The locations were changed often to avoid discovery and were supported through small donations, volunteer help, and the personal resources of women devoted to the cause. As Richardson's research continued, she began to see how cleverly Eleanor and her network worked under the close watch of a society that would have condemned their actions. One of the most striking features was how they hid their work within respected Victorian social structures, church groups, sewing circles, and charitable societies that few people would question closely. Eleanor's place within her sister's household also offered protection. As an unmarried woman living with family, she was expected to help with domestic duties and was technically under her brother-in-law's authority. But Richardson discovered through business records and letters that Thomas Harrison was a forward-thinking merchant who supported temperance reform and believed in better education for working-class children. There was clear proof that he knew the full scope of Eleanor's secret work, but he clearly allowed her wide freedom to continue her nursing and charitable efforts. The timing of the 1887 family photograph proved especially meaningful. Richardson learned that it had been taken just 3 months after a terrible tragedy in Lowell, a fire at a textile mill that killed 7 workers, including 3 young women. The disaster caused public anger and demands for safer conditions, but little actually changed. In the months that followed, Eleanor and the women in her network increased their efforts, helping grieving families and assisting workers who wanted to leave the mills for safer jobs. Richardson realized that the photograph was Eleanor's quiet act of resistance and record-keeping. Unable to speak openly about her work or publicly defend the women she helped, Eleanor found another way to leave proof of her dedication. The hand gesture was her mark, her witness, captured in a moment that would survive her by more than 100 years. Richardson later found that other women in the network had done the same, placing the coded gesture into family portraits, wedding photographs, and even memorial cards. It was as if they understood their work might vanish from history and wanted to leave behind some sign of who they were and what they had done. The danger Eleanor faced by placing the symbol in such a public and lasting form became clearer as Richardson uncovered resistance to women's reform efforts. Newspaper editorials from the period attacked women who interfered in family matters or encouraged wives to leave their homes. Court records showed cases where women who helped others escape abusive marriages were sued for alienation of affections or accused of breaking apart families. The legal and social punishments could be harsh. To understand the true reach of Eleanor's network, Richardson had to go beyond photographs and official documents. She began searching for personal voices, diaries, letters, and oral histories that could reveal the lives behind the coded signs and secret safe houses. This search led her to descendants of women who had been helped by Eleanor and her network in the late 19th century. Through family research and help from local historical societies, Richardson identified several families connected to Lowell's mill district during that time. Many were hesitant at first, especially when the stories involved abuse or social shame. But when Richardson shared Eleanor Parker's photograph and explained her work, some families began to open up, sharing stories passed down quietly through generations. One woman, a retired teacher named Patricia, shared her great-great-grandmother's diary from 1889. The diary belonged to Anne, a mill worker who arrived in Lowell from rural Maine at age 16. Her entries described exhausting labor, dangerous conditions, and wages barely enough for food and lodging. One entry from November 1889 stood out. Met the nurse with kind eyes today. She asked about my cough but seemed to see more. She made the sign, 3 in a circle, and said I had friends if I ever needed help. Months later, after Anne was injured by factory machinery and faced dismissal without pay, Eleanor helped her find work as a domestic servant with a family in Worcester, far from the mills and the supervisors who had pressured her. Anne later married, raised children, and lived to 73, a long life compared to many mill workers who died young from accidents or illness. Another family shared letters that mentioned a safe house on Adams Street in Lowell where women could stay when home life became unbearable. The letters never clearly described events there, but they referred to Eleanor by name and praised her care and secrecy. Richardson traced the address and found it belonged to a widow named Mrs. Whitman, who rented rooms to boarders but never seemed to keep long-term tenants, according to city records. These personal stories showed the real nature of Eleanor's work. Women and children who came to her were given immediate shelter, basic needs, and help finding longer-term answers, new jobs, housing in other cities, and sometimes legal assistance in extreme cases of abuse. The network relied on trust, silence, and the willingness of many women to give whatever they could. Richardson also uncovered the personal cost of this work. Victorian society placed strict limits on women, especially unmarried women who depended on family support. Challenging those limits carried serious risk. In 1892, 5 years after the family portrait was taken, Eleanor Parker's name appeared in Lowell court records. A man named Robert sued her for interfering in his household after she helped his wife and children leave and move to Providence. His testimony claimed Eleanor had turned his wife against him and destroyed his family. Eleanor's own statement told another story of bruises she had seen, children who flinched at loud sounds, and a woman who feared her husband would kill her. The judge dismissed the case, stating that Eleanor acted within her role as a visiting nurse concerned for her patient's safety. Still, the case was reported in newspapers and harmed her reputation. Some church members questioned whether her work was proper for an unmarried woman, and pressure grew on Thomas Harrison to control her activities more closely. Richardson found signs that after the lawsuit, Eleanor became even more careful. After 1892, her name appeared less often in public records and church notes. Officially, she seemed less active, but other evidence showed her work continued, only more hidden. The cost showed in other ways as well. Eleanor never remarried, never had children, and spent her life living in her sister's home, dependent on her brother-in-law. In Victorian terms, this might have been seen as failure. Richardson understood it as a deliberate choice, giving up personal comfort and status for a cause she believed in. Other women in the network faced similar losses. Some were rejected by their families, others lost jobs or housing when their actions were discovered. One woman identified through photographs was briefly jailed in 1894 for hiding a wife who fled her husband. Charges were later dropped, but she spent 3 days in custody. These dangers were real and constant. The final years of Eleanor Parker's life formed the most moving part of Richardson's research. After the 1892 case, Eleanor continued her work more quietly. By the late 1890s, she was in her mid-40s and her health was failing, likely due to the physical strain of nursing and the stress of her secret life. In 1899, her sister Catherine died of pneumonia at age 46. Records showed a short illness that progressed quickly, leaving Thomas Harrison widowed with 3 grown children. Eleanor stayed in the household to manage daily affairs. Richardson later discovered that Catherine's death affected Eleanor deeply. Among Catherine's belongings, uncovered during the estate sale that revealed the photograph, were letters Eleanor had written to her over the years. These letters showed that Catherine had known about the network all along and had quietly supported it, sometimes giving money, sometimes offering her home as a temporary refuge, always protecting Eleanor through silence. One letter from 1891 stood out. Eleanor wrote that she understood the risks her actions brought to the family and that she would leave if Thomas asked, but she could not abandon the work because of the suffering she had seen. Catherine's reply, written on the back of the same page, stated simply that Eleanor would not leave, that her work was right, and that the family was proud of her, even if they could never say so publicly. This exchange gave Richardson a deeper understanding of the 1887 photograph. It was not only Eleanor's personal statement, but also a quiet sign of her family's support. Eleanor Parker died in 1904 at age 51. Her death certificate listed consumption tuberculosis, likely contracted during years of nursing in crowded housing. She was buried in the family plot at Lowell Cemetery, her gravestone reading simply, Eleanor Parker 1853 to 1904. She served the suffering. In February 2025, 4 months after discovering the photograph, Dr. Emily Richardson presented her findings at the Massachusetts Historical Society. More than 200 people attended, including historians, genealogists, descendants of mill workers, and members of the public drawn to Eleanor's story. Richardson displayed the original photograph alongside many others showing the same coded gesture. She shared letters, court records, and personal stories that revealed the size and impact of the network, and she told the stories of women who had been helped, Anne who escaped the mills, the family who fled to Providence, and many others whose names were lost but whose lives were changed. The presentation quickly gained attention beyond academic circles. Local and national media covered the story. Descendants of mill workers began coming forward with family documents and photographs showing the same hand sign. Some discovered their ancestors had been part of Eleanor's network or had been helped by it. The city of Lowell began planning a new exhibition focused on Eleanor Parker and the Women's Protective Network. honoring not just Eleanor but all the working-class women who risked their safety to help others. Richardson continued her research, extending it to other industrial regions. She found signs of similar networks in Pennsylvania coal towns, New York garment districts, and Midwestern factory cities. The same hand gesture appeared in photographs from the 1880s into the early 1900s, showing that this silent language was more widespread than anyone had known. The 1887 Harrison family portrait, once forgotten in an attic, now hangs in the permanent collection of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Visitors pause to study Eleanor Parker's carefully placed hand and reflect on her choice to leave such a bold, lasting record. For Richardson, the work became deeply personal. It revealed a hidden chapter of women's history, a story of courage, unity, and quiet resistance that challenged simple ideas about Victorian life. Eleanor Parker and the women of her network did not wait for laws or approval. They built their own systems of help and survival, working in silence but leaving traces for the future. The hand gesture, once unnoticed, had finally been seen. And with that recognition, Eleanor Parker's message, held in silver and light for 137 years, was finally heard,